plumbing problem at Glen Canyon Dam brings a new threat to the Colorado River system. The concern is about future water delivery issues that are supplied by the Colorado River.
On a quiet morning in March 1996, engineers at the Glen Canyon Dam did something that had not been done in decades. They stood before a massive wall of concrete and pressed a button that would change history. Deep inside the structure, giant steel gates groaned open. For the first time, they unleashed a beast. 264,000 gallons of water per second slammed into a dry riverbed. The ground shook, the roar was deafening. But as the water rushed into the Grand Canyon, sensors picked up a reaction that defied all logic. The river was alive. The flood that nobody expected. At exactly 6:20 in the morning, the world changed. It happened on March 26, 1996. The location was the Glen Canyon Dam, a massive concrete plug stopping up the Colorado River in northern Arizona. The air was cool, but the tension in the control room was hot. Engineers were hovering over panels, ready to execute a sequence that had never been tried before. Basically, they were about to pull the plug. Deep inside the dam, there are 4 giant metal pipes called jet tubes. They are designed to bypass the electricity turbines and just dump water straight into the river below. They are the emergency valves. But on this day, there was no emergency. There was only a theory. The lead engineer gave the signal. Slowly, with a mechanical groan that vibrated through the millions of tons of concrete, the first gate opened. Then the second, then all 4. The sound was not like a waterfall. It was like a jet engine taking off inside a tunnel. A massive white column of water exploded out of the dam. We are talking about 264,000 gallons of water every single second. To put that into perspective, imagine filling an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Now imagine doing that every 2 seconds. That is the kind of power we are talking about. The water hit the riverbed below with enough force to shake the canyon walls. For 30 years, this part of the river had been a tame, controlled stream. It was basically a garden hose compared to its wild past. But now the beast was back. The water level rose instantly. Downstream, the river surged 16 feet higher than normal. It grabbed massive boulders and tossed them like pebbles. It ripped up trees. It scoured the bottom of the channel, lifting millions of tons of sand and silt that had been sitting there for decades. But here's the catch. This was not just about making a splash. This was a desperate medical procedure on a dying patient. The Grand Canyon was sick, and this flood was the defibrillator. Scientists were lined up along the banks, watching their sensors. They expected the water to rise. They expected the sand to move. But what they saw in the first few hours made them question everything they knew about the river. The water was moving faster and carrying more debris than their models predicted. It was a chaotic, churning soup of mud and history. The river was reclaiming territory it had lost a generation ago. You see, before 1963, the Colorado River was a warm, muddy, violent monster. It flooded every spring, reshaping the Grand Canyon, building massive sandy beaches, and creating a specific ecosystem. But when the dam was sealed, the heart of the river stopped beating. The water turned cold and clear. The flood stopped. The sand disappeared. So this artificial flood in 1996 was an attempt to trick nature. It was the largest man-made flood in the history of the United States. For 7 days, they let the water roar. 238 billion gallons of water bypassed the turbines. That is enough water to cover the entire state of Rhode Island a foot deep. It was a spectacle. Tourists flocked to the rim of the canyon to watch the brown snake of water swell and consume the land. But down at the water level, something else was happening. The flood was digging up things that had been buried. It was exposing layers of the riverbed that had not seen the sun since the 60s. And getting this data was expensive. Every drop of water that bypassed the turbines was money lost. The power company was losing millions of dollars in electricity generation to run this experiment. The engineers watched the clock. The scientists watched the sand. Everyone held their breath, waiting to see if the canyon walls would hold up against the sudden pressure. But the real surprise was not the water itself. It was what happened when they turned it off. The sensors picked up a reaction in the landscape that nobody predicted. The sand trap paradox. To understand why that sensor reading was so shocking, you have to understand what we did to this place. It starts in 1963. The Cold War was raging, the Beatles were just starting, and in the American Southwest, the Bureau of Reclamation was finishing one of the greatest engineering feats in human history. The Glen Canyon Dam. It is a monster, 720 feet tall, 1,600 feet wide. It took millions of cubic yards of concrete to build. When they poured the final bucket, they didn't just block a river, they cut off a limb. Behind the dam, the water began to back up, creating Lake Powell. It is the second largest reservoir in the country. It is beautiful, sure, but it came at a terrible price. Before the dam, the Colorado River was like a conveyor belt. It carried millions of tons of sediment, sand, silt, mud, from the Rocky Mountains all the way down to the Gulf of California in Mexico. This sand was the lifeblood of the canyon. Every spring, the snow would melt, the river would flood, and it would deposit this fresh sand all along the banks. These sandbars were crucial. They created calm backwaters for native fish to spawn. They created ground for willow trees to grow. They provided camping spots for explorers. But when the gates of Glen Canyon Dam slammed shut, the conveyor belt stopped. The sand didn't stop coming from the mountains, but now it hits the wall of the dam and sinks to the bottom of Lake Powell. It is trapped. Below the dam, the water coming out is what scientists call hungry water. It is clear, it is cold, and because it has no sand in it, it travels faster. It picks up the sand that is already in the canyon and washes it away, but it never replaces it. So year after year, the Grand Canyon started to go bald. The beaches shrank. The foundations of the cliffs were exposed, and that's putting it lightly. The ecosystem went into shock. The water used to be warm and muddy. Now it was icy cold and crystal clear. The native fish, like the humpback chub, started to die off because they couldn't handle the cold. In their place, non-native species took over. Trout thrived. They love clear, cold water. But they are predators. They ate the native fish. On the banks, invasive plants like tamarisk and camelthorn moved in. Without the yearly floods to wash them out, they formed thick, impenetrable jungles along the river. They choked out the native plants. The river guides noticed it first. They had been rafting the canyon for decades. Suddenly, their favorite campsites were gone. Just jagged rocks where soft sand used to be. The river was shrinking too. It became a narrow channel, deep and fast, instead of a wide, braiding river. By the early 90s, scientists realized they had made a huge mistake. They had turned a wild, dynamic ecosystem into a static, dying drainage ditch. The Glen Canyon Dam manages almost every mile of the river's flow. It is a machine. We decide when the river rises. We decide when it falls. And usually we decide based on when people in Phoenix and Las Vegas turn on their air conditioners. The river does not flow to the rhythm of nature anymore. It flows to the rhythm of the electricity market. This was the context for the 1996 flood. It was an attempt to hit the reset button, but there was a dark history hovering over the control room that day. A memory of a time when the dam almost failed completely. It's not that simple though, because just a few years before they tried to fix the river with a controlled flood, the river tried to destroy the dam with an uncontrolled one, and that event revealed a weakness in the rock itself. What they found in the tunnels was like something out of a horror movie. The cavitation nightmare. Let's rewind to June of 1983. This is the story they don't like to tell on the tour boats. That year, there was too much snow in the Rockies. Then there was a sudden heat wave. The snow melted all at once. A massive wall of water came rushing down into Lake Powell. The reservoir filled up faster than anyone thought possible. The water was lapping at the very top of the dam. If it went over the top, it could erode the dam's foundation and cause a catastrophic collapse. The engineers had no choice. They had to open the spillways. These are not the jet tubes we talked about earlier. These are massive tunnels carved through the solid sandstone rock around the dam. They are like slides for giants. They opened the gates. The water roared into the tunnels at incredible speeds. At first, everything seemed fine. The water shot out into the river below, creating a massive spray. But then the ground started to shake. The engineers standing on the dam felt the concrete vibrating beneath their feet. It was a deep, rumbling growl. Then the observers down by the river saw something that made their blood run cold. The water coming out of the tunnels changed color. It went from clear to pink to a deep, dark red. It looked like the river was bleeding, and in a way it was. Inside the tunnels, a phenomenon called cavitation was happening. The water was moving so fast that it was creating vacuum bubbles. When these bubbles collapsed, they created tiny shock waves. These shock waves were tearing the concrete lining of the tunnels apart. They were ripping through the steel reinforcement bars. They were eating into the soft sandstone bedrock of the canyon wall itself. The red in the water was the mountain being chewed up and spit out. The engineers had to make a terrifying choice. If they kept the gates open, the tunnels might collapse and the water could bypass the dam entirely, potentially destroying the whole structure. If they closed the gates, the water would overtop the dam and wash it away. They managed to use plywood sheets, yes, plywood, to extend the top of the dam gates just enough to hold the water back while they throttled the spillways. They survived by inches. When the water finally receded, they inspected the tunnels. The damage was catastrophic. There were holes so big you could fit a house inside them. The rock had been scoured away by the sheer force of the physics. This disaster proved something terrifying. The rock here is soft. The forces are massive, and we are not always in control. So, fast forward back to 1996. When they proposed the artificial flood, the ghost of 1983 was in the room. They weren't using the spillways this time, they were using the jet tubes, but the fear was the same. Would the vibration damage the dam? Would the sudden pressure trigger a rock slide? It was a calculated risk. But the 1996 experiment revealed something else. Everyone's obsessed with the water, but the real story was the sand. During the flood, the river did exactly what they hoped it would do at first. It grabbed the sand from the bottom of the channel and threw it up onto the banks. New beaches appeared overnight. Scientists were high-fiving. It looked like a total victory. But then the water went down, and the sensors kept recording. Within weeks, the new beaches began to collapse. Tia River, returning to its hungry state, started eating the new sandbars. It turned out that the sand they had stirred up wasn't enough. They were just rearranging the furniture in a burning house. The 1996 flood proved that you can't just push a button and fix an ecosystem. You need a constant supply of new material. And this is where the story gets even more complicated. Because the disappearing sand isn't just about campers or fish, it's about the ghosts of the canyon. The floodwaters were protecting something ancient, something that, once exposed, disappears forever. The lost history of the river. What most people don't realize is that the Grand Canyon is not just a geological park. It is a graveyard. It is a library. It is a home. For at least 9,000 years, humans have lived down there in the canyon depths. We are talking about the ancestors of the modern Pueblo people, the Hopi, the Zuni, the Navajo. They lived along the riverbanks. They built stone houses. They built granaries to store their corn and beans high up in the cliffs. They carved petroglyphs into the rock walls. They buried their dead in the soft earth. For thousands of years, the Colorado River protected these sites. How? With sand. The massive, muddy floods of the past would pile up huge dunes of sand along the banks. This sand acted like a blanket. It covered the ancient foundations. It buffered the cliffs from the wind. But when the Glen Canyon Dam stopped the sand, the blanket was pulled away. Now the wind blows through the canyon and there is no new sand to replace what blows away. The old dunes are deflating. As the sand disappears, the ancient sites are being exposed. Imagine a stone wall that has been buried for 1,000 years. Suddenly, it is out in the open rain and wind. It begins to crumble. Pottery shards that have sat undisturbed since the time of the Crusades are suddenly washing into the river. Archaeologists are racing against time. They are watching 5,000 years of history literally dissolve into the water. The artificial floods were supposed to fix this too. The idea was that if we could rebuild the sandbars, the wind would blow that new sand up into the dunes and rebury the history. It was a brilliant theory. In 2004 and 2008, they tried again. They timed the floods better. They waited until the Pariah River, a tributary below the dam, dumped a load of mud into the main channel. Then they opened the gates, hoping to catch that fresh mud and ride it downstream. It worked better than 96, but it was still a temporary fix. The sensors showed that the sandbars would build up and then over 6 months to a year, they would vanish again. The hungry water always won in the end. Basically, we are on life support. The tribes who call the canyon sacred, the Havasupai, the Hualapai, the Navajo, watch this with deep sadness. To them, the river is a living being. The dam didn't just stop the water, it stopped the river's heartbeat. And now the stakes are getting even higher. Because it's not just about the past anymore. It's about the future survival of the entire American West. We are running out of water. The experiments proved we can move sand, but they couldn't prove we can make water appear out of thin air. And get this, the most recent data suggests that the era of artificial floods might be over before we even really figured it out. The reservoir is dropping. The pipes are getting dry. We are approaching a point where the river won't even be able to reach the tubes to flood the canyon. When the taps run dry. So here's the deal. We have spent millions of dollars and decades of research trying to engineer a fake river inside a real canyon. We played God with the geography. We built the dam, we stopped the floods, and then, when we realized we messed up, we tried to fix it with artificial floods. We found out that we can rebuild the beaches, but only for a little while. We found out we can protect the archaeology, but it is a constant, grueling battle against erosion. We thought we had the upper hand. But now we are facing a villain that no amount of engineering, no amount of concrete, and no amount of money can defeat. Drought. But calling it a drought is almost an insult. What is happening in the Colorado River Basin right now is something much darker. Scientists are calling it a mega drought. It is the driest period in 1,200 years. Think about that. You have to go back to the time of Charlemagne or the height of the Mayan civilization to find a time when this land was this thirsty. And the evidence is staring us right in the face. If you look at Lake Powell today, you see it. There is a giant ghostly white bathtub ring around the reservoir. It is a stain of calcium carbonate left on the red rocks. It shows you exactly where the water used to be, and it is hundreds of feet above where the water is now. This changes everything. Remember the cost of those artificial floods we talked about? The millions of dollars in lost power generation? Well, the stakes just went through the roof. Back then, water was just a resource. Now, water is more valuable than gold. It is more valuable than oil. Every drop we release for a fake flood to save a sandbar is a drop that isn't spinning a turbine to light up a hospital in Phoenix. It is a drop that isn't watering a lettuce field in Yuma. It is a drop that isn't keeping a golf course green in Las Vegas. The conflict is brutal. It is ugly. On one side, you have the ecosystem, the humpback chub fish, the willow flycatchers, the ancient ruins, the hikers. They are screaming for the water. They need the floods to clear the sediment and rebuild the habitat. On the other side, you have 40 million people, 40 million humans who built their lives in a desert because they were promised that this river would never run dry. In 2018, the situation got so desperate that they had to stop the experiments entirely. There simply wasn't enough water to spare. The canyon went dry of floods for 5 long years. The beaches began to rot away. The invasive species moved in. It looked like the end. Then, in April 2023, nature threw us a bone. It was a freak event. A massive, record-breaking winter slammed the Rockies. Snowpack levels were off the charts. The Bureau of Reclamation saw an opening. They seized the moment. They launched a 72-hour high-flow experiment. Once again, the jet tubes opened. Once again, the river roared. For 3 days, it looked like the old Colorado. It looked like the wild river of the 19th century. But to many experts, this didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a farewell tour. It felt like a dying star letting out one last burst of light before it goes black. Because here is the terrifying truth that the government reports usually hide in the fine print. Scientists know that climate change is shrinking the river permanently. The flow is predicted to drop by 20 to 30% by mid-century. The snowpack is melting too fast. The soil is too dry. It sucks up the water before it even reaches the river. And this leads us to the doomsday scenario. It is a concept called dead pool. No, not the superhero. This is much scarier. You see, the Glen Canyon Dam works on gravity. The water has to be high enough to flow into the penstocks, the intake pipes that spin the turbines. If Lake Powell drops below a certain elevation, specifically 3,490 feet, the water can no longer reach the turbines. The hydropower shuts off. Instantly, Millions of people lose a critical source of clean electricity. The grid destabilizes. The air conditioning in the scorching Arizona summer stops working. But it gets worse. If the water drops even lower past the bypass tubes, the dam becomes a literal concrete wall. The water will just sit there, trapped behind the dam, unable to flow downstream at all. If that happens, the Grand Canyon below the dam dries up completely. We aren't talking about low flow, we are talking about no flow. The Grand Canyon becomes a dry wash. It becomes a silent, dusty trench that only sees water when it rains locally. The tamarisk will die, the trout will die. The rafting industry, a multi-million-dollar economy, will vanish overnight. The heat in the canyon, without the cooling effect of the river, will become unbearable. It will essentially become a furnace. Some theorists believe we are looking at an Aral Sea situation. Look at what happened in the Soviet Union. They diverted the rivers feeding the Aral Sea to grow cotton. It worked for a while, but then the sea vanished. Ships were left stranded in the middle of a toxic desert. The dust from the dry lake bed filled with pesticides and salt blew into the towns and poisoned the population. Cancer rates skyrocketed. Could that happen here? If the Colorado River stops flowing, the exposed riverbed turns into toxic dust. The winds pick it up. And where does that wind blow? Right into the lungs of the people in Las Vegas and Los Angeles. The artificial floods of the 90s and 2000s were a noble experiment. They showed us that the landscape reacts. It wants to heal. When water hit that dry soil in 2023, life sprang back with shocking speed. The reaction nobody predicted was just how resilient nature actually is. It is desperate to return to normal. It is fighting for its life. But we have built a world that cannot afford to let nature take its course. We are trapped in a trap of our own design. We need the dam for power and water, but the dam is slowly killing the canyon. And now the sky has stopped giving us the water we need to keep the charade going. The miracle of 2023 was just a band-aid on a bullet wound. The mega drought isn't going anywhere. And as the water level in Lake Powell inches closer and closer to the intake pipes, we have to ask ourselves a question we never thought we'd have to answer. What happens when the tap runs dry? The Great Collapse. The reaction of the sensors back in '96 taught us a valuable lesson. You can fight nature, but you have to be ready for the punchback. And nature hits hard. We are now living in the shadow of a decision made 70 years ago. When they poured that concrete to build Glen Canyon Dam, they thought they were conquering the wilderness. They thought they were civilizing the West. But some historians and geologists are now pointing to a terrifying parallel. Look at the Maya. The Mayan civilization was a powerhouse of engineering. They built massive reservoirs, complex cisterns, and water management systems that were centuries ahead of their time. They supported a massive population in a jungle environment that had distinct dry seasons. They felt invincible. Then the climate shifted. A series of mega droughts hit. Their engineering, as brilliant as it was, couldn't conjure water out of thin air. The reservoirs ran dry. The crops failed. The society collapsed into chaos and warfare. The great cities were abandoned to the jungle. Are we repeating the cycle? We have 40 million people dependent on a water system that was designed during an unusually wet century. We built our civilization, our empire of the desert, based on data that was a fluke. And now the bill is due. So what is the solution? This is where the theories get wild and the debate turns violent. There is a growing movement once considered a fringe conspiracy of eco-terrorists but now gaining traction among serious scientists. They say we should drain Lake Powell. They say tear down the dam. The argument is simple. Lake Powell is a mistake. It is a giant evaporation pan. Because the reservoir spreads the water out over such a huge surface area under the blazing desert sun, we lose roughly 170 billion gallons of water every year just to evaporation. That is enough water to supply the entire city of Los Angeles. Gone into thin air. The Phil Mead first proposal suggests we stop trying to keep two half-empty buckets. We should drain Lake Powell, let the water flow downstream to fill up Lake Mead, the reservoir behind Hoover Dam, and let Glen Canyon be restored to its natural state. If we did that, the Colorado River would run free through the Grand Canyon again. The floods would return naturally. The sediment would return. The ecosystem would explode with life. The fake river would become real again. But to the power brokers in Washington and the utility companies, that idea is impossible. They say it would leave millions without power. They argue that the grid cannot handle the loss of the Glen Canyon hydroelectric plant. They say it is a national security risk. But here is a darker theory that is circulating in the underground forums. Some believe that the government knows the dead pool is inevitable. They believe that the frantic cloud seeding experiments where we shoot silver iodide into clouds to force rain are acts of desperation. There are rumors that the water crisis is being managed not to save the river, but to secure water rights for future ARC zones. Underground aquifers and private reserves for the ultra-rich who are buying up land in places with independent water sources. So, would you tear down the dam to save the canyon, or is electricity more important than a pile of sand? It's a choice between history and survival. Let me know in the comments. If you learned something new, hit like and subscribe.